All right. Good day, everyone. We are Group 6, and today we're going to report about the Nicomachean Ethics by Aristotle. So, our topic for today would be about, of course, we'll initially discuss the introduction, the human good, moral virtue, pleasure, and happiness. Uh, our reporters would be Macy Baxinela, Cleofe Mae Bernal, Angelina Patricia Bondad, yours truly, Jeush Othniel Cabatino, Leigh Gabrielle Marie P. Vacio, and Athena Ledesma. Fun fact about the reporters, we are all students of BA in Literature too. All right, now for the introduction, we are to discuss two facets. All right, so the first one would be the subject of inquiry, uh, which also has two elements. And of course, the second facet would be the nature of the science, which will be having one element. All right, so let's begin with um, this subject of inquiry. First would be all human activities aim at some good. However, some goods subordinate to others. All right, so um, what does this mean? Um, every art and every inquiry, every action and choice aims at some good. Some are activities, others are products of the activities that produce them. All right, and it is the nature of the products to be better than the activities, of course. Now, as there are many actions, arts, and sciences, their ends are also apparently many. The end of the medical art is health, that of shipbuilding, a vessel, that of strategy, victory, that of economics, wealth. Now, for the second facet, the science of human good, or of the human good, rather, is politics. What does this mean? This simply means that human good is politics as similar to politics. What defines or that which defines human good is that which legislates as to what we are to do and what we are to abstain from. Now, for the nature of the science, it is indicated here that we must not expect more precision than the subject matter admits of. The student should have reached years of discretion. All right, so this simply means that each man judges well the things he knows, and of this he is a good judge. And so the man who has been educated in a subject is a good judge of that subject, and the man who has received an all-round education is a good judge in general. Now let's proceed to the human good. What specifically is the human good? All right. It is generally agreed to be happiness, but there are various views as to what happiness is. All right, so it has been established from the previous topic that knowledge in every pursuit aims at some good, and that which is political gravitates toward the highest of all goods that are achievable by action. In a verbal sense, there is a general agreement among the masses that it is happiness. Hence, living well and faring well are also deemed as happiness. But with regard to what happiness is, they differ, and the many do not give the same account as the wise. For the former rather, we might ponder that it is some plain and obvious or apparent thing. As such, it can be pleasure, wealth, or honor. They differ, however, from one another, and often even the same man identifies it with different things. With with wealth when he is ill, or with health when he is ill, rather, with wealth when he's poor, but conscious of their ignorance. Of course, they admire those who proclaim some great thing that is above their comprehension. Uh, what is the human good again? Okay, so for a second on the list, human good, or the human good is uh, deemed to uh, possess this, some kind of form of good. There is a philosophical view that there is a form of good. All right, so what does this mean? Plato believes that knowledge originates from the form or idea, whereas things that are truthful and just gain their value from the good. It is the pursuit of good that humans are incumbent upon, or in layman's term, the humans are responsible, are responsible in pursuing what is good. However, this would rather be done in vain without philosophical reasoning. This simply means that uh, without the presence of any philosophical reasoning, one cannot attain that which is good. Okay. Uh, for the last facet in our list, again, what is the human good? The human good must be something final and self-sufficient. All right, so what does this mean? What do we mean here when we say that the good must be something final and self-sufficient? All right, so this simply pertains to the act of making life as desirable as possible, and that which lacks nothing. So it must be complete. And in here, shall be perceived as happiness. With this, it must be the most desirable of all things, although um, not a thing counted as one good thing among others. However, if it were to be counted thoroughly, it would be made more desirable by the addition of even the least of goods. For that which is added becomes an excess of goods, and of goods the greater is, of course, always always more desirable. Happiness then is, in conclusion, we can now uh, deem it as, uh, happiness is something final and, of course, self-sufficient, and certainly it must be the end of action. Now for the kinds of virtue, let us listen to Miss Macy Baxinela. Macy?
Hello everyone, I am Macy Baxinela. So for the next 3 slides, I'm going to discuss 3 key points about virtue, the kinds of virtue, and how moral virtue is acquired, and the definition of moral virtue. Virtue, what does this mean? So in the Nicomachean Ethics book, it is said that the virtue we must study is human virtue, for the good we were seeking was human good, and the happiness, human happiness. By human virtue, we mean not that of the body, but of the soul. And happiness also we call an activity of soul. So let's proceed to the 2 kinds of virtue in accordance with difference. The intellectual virtue and the moral virtue. It is said that intellectual virtue is acquired by learning, while moral virtue is acquired by habituation. What do we mean by this? Intellectual virtue is acquired by learning, as it owes both its growth and birth to teaching, while moral virtue is acquired by habituation as it is one that is formed by a slight variation from the word ethos means habit. Um, it is none of the moral virtues arises in us by nature. So in short, moral virtue is non-existence in nature. The second one, intellectual virtue is aimed for scientific understanding, while moral virtue is aimed for proper behavioral conduct and manner. So, in intellectual virtue is more on theoretical knowledge, while moral virtue is on practical knowledge. It is applied, it is practiced. It is not just being acquired through learning or teaching, but it is, yeah, about application. It in intellectual virtue, it uses particular cases to better understand abstract truths, while moral virtue, in contrast, uses theoretical knowledge naman to better understand particular truths. In intellectual virtue, abstract truths is centered, while moral virtue is particular to particular truths, not the abstract truths. So, in intellectual virtue, it involves curiosity, confidence, and reason, and imaginativeness, among others, while moral virtue involves generosity, fairness, and temperance, among others. It is you can um, decipher here that moral virtue is more on quality of the person, the characteristics of a person, since it includes generosity, fairness, temperance, while in the intellectual side naman, it is more on curiosity, more of the function of the brain, the ideas. So, intellectual virtue, it is where the wisdom governs, while on moral virtue, it is found in the middle of the extremes of two extremes, the golden mean. Next slide, we're going to discuss how is moral virtue acquired. So it's just a continuation of how moral virtue or the definition of moral virtue. Moral virtue, like the arts, is acquired by repetition of the corresponding acts. This cannot be described exactly, but must avoid excess and defect. If pleasure in doing virtuous acts is a sign that the virtuous disposition has been acquired. A variety of considerations show the essential connection of moral virtue or moral virtue with pleasure and pain, and an objective to the view that one acquires virtues by doing virtuous acts and the conditions needed to possess virtue and act from it. The next slide is the definition of moral virtue. We have said that earlier that the genus of moral virtue, it is a state of character, not a passion or a capacity. The differential of moral virtues, it is a disposition to choose the intermediate, two kinds of intermediate distinguished together. So that ends my presentation. Thank you.
Characteristics of the extreme and mean states. Aristotle presented two extreme vices for each character trait, an excess and a deficit. An excess is having too much of something, like a man with too much confidence, while a deficit is having too little, like a man who is cowardly and excessive in fear. The in between of these excesses is the mean, which Aristotle considers to be a virtue. However, he also concludes that it requires demanding work to achieve this mean, and is difficult to determine. Aristotle then opts to aim for the lesser of evils between these extremes. Two opposed views about pleasure. Pleasure is something that the philosophers considered to be closely linked to human life. Because of this, pleasure and pain are used in steering the youth through their education. Furthermore, the development of a virtuous character may depend primarily on what one enjoys or gets pleasure from and what one hates. The philosophers disputed their views of pleasure. While some argue that it is wholly bad, others believe that it is the ultimate good. And next is the discussion on the view that pleasure is good. The discussion of the view that pleasure is the good opens with Eudoxus' thought of pleasure being the highest good. Since through observation, both rational and non-rational creatures aim at pleasure. However, Plato argues that pleasure cannot be the highest good because it is preferable with prudence rather than without. It is then stated that only pleasures that come from honorable deeds are the ones that are worthy of choice.
In addition to the previous topic, there are also arguments that go against the view that pleasure is the good, and that pleasure is may also be viewed as something wholly bad. The first argument that Aristotle introduced is that pleasure is not a quality, thus it is not good. It is because what creatures who enjoy pleasure try to seek may not be good. Good is something that is determinate, while pleasure is indeterminate, since it has certain degrees. This is because good is definite as it has boundaries where you can no longer say it is good. Pleasure has degrees based on the notion that one may be pleased faster or slower than others during a particular activity. Pleasure as motion or process is not perfect or complete among generations, which makes it not the good at all, as good is something complete. Next is the disreputability of pleasure, which makes it go against what is good. It is because some pleasures may appear to be problematic for some people. Aristotle exemplified that a friend is different from a flatterer. Both may make you feel pleasant, but the way we interact with them and the intentions behind those actions may differ. For the next part is the definition of pleasure. Pleasure is defined as not a process because it is mainly a natural accompaniment to an activity one is engaged with. It arises through activity and makes doing the activity for others feel complete, especially in the perfection of the activity. Furthermore, pleasure is not necessarily to be concluded as good or bad, but as something that perfects doing the activity. These activities may differ in the pleasure one enjoys, mainly because there are different kinds of pleasure and pleasure is different in some ways than others. A person pursues this kind of activity more ardently and more consistently than others, as it is more pleasurable for that person than for other people. Activities also have different modes of perfection, mainly based on the manner in which one completes or perfects the activity. Senses like seeing and hearing are faculties necessary for how one appreciates a certain object. So the pleasure in listening to music and seeing a sculpture is different from others. Activities also differ in moral values. Some do noble activities, and pleasures that make them perfect the activity is a good kind of pleasure, while some may have perverted taste, which contaminates pleasure, and this perfection of doing unworthy activity induces bad pleasures. Some pleasures are also distinctively human pleasures. As the saying goes, asses would prefer sweepings to gold, because animals such as the horse would prefer food to gold. Thus, it creates a difference in pleasure between certain kind of species. And that's all. Thank you.
Hi, at this point, I am going to discuss about happiness according to Aristotle. His first notion is happiness is a good activity. It's not an amusement. According to Anarcharchis, who is a Scythian prince, amusement is a mean, a form of relaxation. Of course, as humans, we need relaxation because we cannot work continuously. We get tired and exhausted. But then, relaxation is not an end because it is taken for the sake of an activity. It's even stated that to work oneself for the sake of amusement is childish and silly because a happy life is thought to be virtuous. Now, a virtuous life needs exertion, which is not consists in amusement. Next is happiness is the end of human affairs. We do not choose happiness for something else because it is the end of it all. Sometimes we choose something for someone else, but when we choose happiness, we choose it for itself because it is the best life for all human beings. His next notion is happiness is not a state of mind. It is not a subjective being. In fact, it is attainable by action, by living well. Next is happiness does not lack in anything. It is self-sufficient. He argued that contemplation or theoria best satisfies these criteria, while a life of morally virtuous activity comes second. Self-sufficiency that we're talking here must belong to the contemplative activity. This notion is connected to the next notion that I will be explaining, which is that happiness is an activity in accordance with a virtue, but it must be with the highest virtue, because the activity with accordance with proper virtue will be the perfect happiness. So why contemplative activity? Because first, this activity is the best, and secondly, it is the most continuous since we can contemplate truth more continuously than we can do anything. Sometimes we think of pleasure as something connected with happiness or the reason behind happiness. It can be, but the activity of the philosophic wisdom is admittedly the pleasantest of virtuous activities. Therefore, the contemplative life is the happiest life. Again, the contemplative life is the happiest. Contemplative life is the happiest because we can attain perfect happiness in accordance to proper virtue. Contemplative activity occurs when the intellect studies the highest truths and objects, as distinct from the use of intellect in practical manner. And wisdom is the virtue of the contemplative intellect.
Superiority of the contemplative life further considered. The life in accordance with the other kind of virtue is happy. Happiness is the activity needed by our human state. Just and brave and other virtues acts we do in relation to each other. The moral virtues must belong to our composite nature, and the virtues of our composite nature are human. This corresponds that the life and happiness are being connected with the passion. Aristotle added that all manner of actions are with regards to passions, which typically human. For Aristotle, the whole life of the god is blessed, and also the man, which in so far as some likeness of such activity belongs to them. Happiness, therefore, must be some form of contemplation. And those to whom contemplation more fully belongs are more happy. Legislation is needed if the end is to be attained. Transition to the politics. We are made good by nature, others by habituation, others by teaching. The man who is to be good must be well trained and habituated. This brought about men live in accordance with a sort of reason and right order. Aristotle suggests that the detail is worked out with more precision if the oversight is on an individual basis, for each person is more likely to get what suits his case. In some particular detail, it may look after by an unscientific person if he has studied accurately in the light of experience what happens in each case. Therefore, Aristotle believed if a man thus wished to become master of an art or science, he must go to the universal. Legislator ought to stimulate men to virtue and urge them forward by the motive of the noble. We shall need laws generally to cover the whole life, for most people obey necessity rather than argument, and punishments rather than the sense of what is noble. And that's all for the report of Group 6. Thank you for listening.